Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me. We're going to do a little vlog today about downsizing. It's a topic that I had been speaking on Dundalk FM about very recently, and we'd had a very strong response to it, and people asked us to give a little bit more insight into this really critical area. So let's talk about downsizing. The first thing about downsizing is what we're talking about here is where you own a property which is no longer suited to your needs size wise. That is to say, it's too big and really a smaller property would be much more appropriate and suitable for you. Generally, the three biggest factors which influence a decision to downsize or thinking about downsizing are location, practicality, and energy efficiency. And of course, the third one there, energy efficiency, is very much front of mind these days. But in location terms, sometimes the home that perhaps, and I'm really speaking a lot here about people who are maybe empty nesters where their children have grown up and moved out, and there's one or two spouses remaining in the property. So perhaps the location is a little bit more remote than now suits these people. Perhaps they want to be a little bit less dependent on the car, and perhaps they also want to have more of a neighborhood nearby for their own safety and, security purposes. The next, practicality. And if you think about it, about a property which has stairs in particular, it may not be practical, or it may potentially be less practical in the future to be relying upon those stairs to get to the bedroom or to get to the bathroom. So practicality is a big factor. And then the third is energy efficiency. And in my experience, people who are thinking about downsizing tend to come from a place where they own a larger house, which has maybe an E or even an F energy efficiency, is really hard to heat, with the result that many of the rooms are actually doors closed, radiators off, because they feel they don't need to heat those rooms. And when you don't heat a room, this itself gives rise to problems such as dampness. The rooms become musty and so on, and also they become filled as storage units. So everybody starts to pile the stuff into the spare rooms in mum and dad's house. So there's an issue there when the rooms aren't being used properly. So the advice that I give to people in the first instance is to write down why you're thinking about making this decision, why you're thinking about moving and downsizing. The typical reasons that people tell me are the house is too big, it's too expensive to keep and to maintain. And this reflects in the internal and in the external of the property. So often we're talking about maybe a property that's on a half or three-quarters of an acre. It's a lot of grass to cut and it's a lot of weeds to pull in the springtime. And people just really don't have the interest or the capacity or perhaps the energy to deal with that when they get to a certain stage in their life. Perhaps they've lost a spouse and it's become just too emotional to be remaining on in the property where they it was their marriage home, where they had raised their children, and now it's an empty house, and that sort of becomes a little bit too much of an emotional burden for them. Car dependency, which I mentioned before, is a big thing. Really, people want to be able to, be somewhere where they can go for a walk for exercise. So that's walking down a village or a town high street rather than jumping into the car all the time, because also, having the opportunity to do some exercise remains very important, and being able to do that easily and safely is important as well. A key thing that comes up again and again is thinking about downsizing because your family think that you should move, and on the reverse, that family members think that you shouldn't move. So family interest in the property is a really, really big consideration in downsizing. So I say to people to just make this decision on your own terms. That is really the most important piece of advice that I would give. Make the decision on your own terms and think about the seasonality of your current home. You've got grass to cut in the summer and you've got dark, short, cold days in the winter where the house has to be heated up. So if you're thinking about this decision, whatever time of the year, try to take a 12-month perspective on it. And I think that, whilst you might be enjoying the summertime in the garden, think about the leaves in the autumn and think about, perhaps the frost in the wintertime. So then once you've started to jot down the notes of why you're thinking about this, think then about the downsides and the upsides of a potential downsize. So for example, on the upside, you might be releasing equity in your existing home, which will enable you to move into another home that's more suitable to your current stage of life. You might as a result of a move, find that you have more freedom due to the time that you've now freed up, that you no longer have to be looking after the gardens or cleaning the house, or driving from place to place. Perhaps if you're moving into a more urban environment, you automatically have more freedom. You also have new neighbours. And I know that you would think that's also a downside because you could be losing neighbours, but you have to balance these. This upside downside list gives you a chance to really, the same thing could go into both columns, but it's important that you acknowledge it and see it. So new neighbours is an important thing. You could find that you're moving in closer to friends, and then you get a chance to spend more time with valued friends. Moving could give you an opportunity to get closer or maybe further from your family and grandchildren. Important to put that down because sometimes this is an opportunity for people in the empty nest stage to make more concerted decisions about how they're going to choose their time, how they're going to spend their time, and how they're going to prioritize their time. And if you have grandchildren in different places, it might, that might also give you food for thought in terms of how you're going to split your time. It could be an opportunity to move to whatever activities and focuses give you joy. For example, if you play golf, do you want to move closer to the golf club? Do you want to move closer to your grandchildren? Do you want to move closer to your train station? I'm currently selling a property for a gentleman who wants to move to within walking distance of the train station so that he can go to Dublin and he can go and have lunch. He's got the free pass. He can go to Dublin for lunch or for dinner, come back home, and he doesn't have to be driving in the dark to do that. And they are really practical considerations. So on the downside of your page, you might, for example, write down that it's too emotional for you to take into consideration at the moment. And if it is, it is. And you write it down, you take a full assessment of it, and then you can park it and come back to it next year. A lot of people say to me that on the downside that they really want to host the big important events like Christmas, like maybe there's a family communion or confirmation or a wedding coming up and they want to be able to host it in the family home. That's an important thing, and that's perhaps emotionally very crucial for people who are in this situation. So that simply means that you put it into a timeline and you work your timeline around that important event. But when it comes to Christmas lunch, remember, when you're hosting Christmas lunch, you're giving yourself a whole world of work to do for one day. And you might be surprised at how enjoyable Christmas becomes when you don't have to cook a massive turkey on the day. So think about that as well. And some people also say to me that they feel that putting the property on the market, people coming to the property, that would feel intrusive. What I would say to that is, by the way, with the way the internet is now, we take a huge amount of tire clicking out of the process now, for example, with our own virtual viewings. It means that there's far less intrusion into the property. So far, you've written down the reasons why you're thinking about downsizing, and you've written down the pros and cons, the upsides and downsides of a possible downsize move. The next thing to do is to think about the costs, because as you will well know, it's very important to be budgeting and planning in advance. So think first about the money in opportunity of potential downsize. You could be releasing equity in the home, depending upon the value of your home. It is important that you get advice on that so that you know what you're talking about and what you're looking at. It might release money that if you wanted to gift money to your family, if that is a priority for you, and always get tax advice about that, because you can give annual amounts to people which are tax-free to family. You could generate income or funds from the proceeds of the sale of the contents of your property, particularly if you're living in a larger property. You are not going to need all that much furniture in your next home. And the thing about it is, more modern homes now don't really lend themselves to larger pieces of furniture. And I frequently meet people who are downsizing from their empty nest, and they're worried about being able to accommodate large dining suites, large bookcases, and so on. So, you need to think about that as well. Also, in the financial benefits category, a smaller house is far cheaper to run, far cheaper to heat, far cheaper to basically do everything in. So remember that is a financial benefit, a financial consideration. And you will also have, for example, a lower house insurance. If you're moving into a more urban area, for example, you'll have less costs on your car, you'll have less fuel to put into the car. So they're important considerations as well. In terms of what it will cost you, you have to bear in mind the costs of spending, the cost of selling a home, and if you need to do some things to prepare your house for sale, or if you need to carry out compliance works to make sure that it is a saleable item. You'll have moving costs, legal fees, you might have an engineer to pay. You'll probably have at least one skip to fill the stuff that you no longer need and that you no longer have a future home for. You'll have estate agency fees, and you may have refurbishment costs on the property that you're going to buy. I recently sold a lovely, very future-proofed 3-bedroom bungalow to a lady. She sold her large family home. She's moving into this far more compact home. She has had the reconciliation emotionally with the furniture that she no longer needs. In fact, she ultimately sold her family home and included a lot of those pieces of furniture in them because they were so suited to them. Um, and when she moves into her next home now, she is going to carry out some refurbishment to bring it up to a really strong BER rating so that she's got low running costs. And remember, whenever you do refurbishment costs that benefit a BER, that is investment that will stand you in good stead, not only on your running costs, but then on the value of your home. So you've now made 3 big steps. You've thought about why you might do it. You've thought about the upsides and downsides, and you've recognized that there is financial gain and financial cost involved in downsizing. So the next step is that you need to prepare yourself. Get yourself a timeline and build into that things like, for example, if there's a family event coming up that you feel your family home has a role to play, okay? The decluttering is the next thing. Now, it is a very easy word to say, and I fully acknowledge it's very easy for somebody like me to come and tell you to declutter your home. And I'm asking you to sort through decades, of life and of experiences and memories and the stuff with which we surround ourselves. However, it is essential that it be done. And for downsizers, it does take longer because there's more of life that's in your home. So it's emotional. It's emotional. It's just a thing that you do on your own time and in your own terms. And as with all decluttering, and I think we have some advice on the YouTube channel already about how to declutter, and it's all about bite-sized chunks. Don't do it by room, do it by segment of a room, do it by a bookshelf, then do it by a chest of drawers. And in that way, it's manageable and you won't, get distracted and end up spending a whole weekend looking in photo albums. The team that you use to make this move is really important. Research the team and pick a team that you will trust. Now, the people that are on this team will be your solicitor, your estate agent, potentially an engineer, potentially also a doctor, which I will come on to in a few moments. So make sure that you're surrounding yourselves with the professionals that you can trust, because this is a big move for you. Next, consider complications or implications such as a property chain. You're going to be buying subject to selling your larger home, so you need to make sure that you factor that into your timeline as well. Just to touch then on the medical thing, get advice from your medical professional, because these steps are big and these decisions are big. Perhaps it might create anxiety and you want to get some help or talk to somebody about your anxiety. You might want to get medical advice from a practical consideration. So, for example, you might want to talk about mobility and ask your doctor or your physiotherapist what kind of factors you need to look for in your next home. Might it be, for example, that there's potential for a wet room rather than having to climb into a bath? Might you want to have a single-story house rather than a two-story house? If you are looking into a future where mobility and stairs may present a challenge to you, look at what you might need to do in your next home in terms of retrofitting for mobility. These are all important factors, and you're not expected to know all of the answers. You can go and ask for help and advice about these things. You next need to start looking at properties, because it's only by starting to look that you'll start to get a sense of what is for you and what you like and what you don't like. And by having done all those lists that I previously mentioned, that will really help you to focus, okay? And again, a point that I mentioned before, make your decisions on your own terms and in your own time. The next thing, very important factor, is make sure you're asking the right people for advice. A great home could be overlooked or a bad home could seem attractive depending upon who is guiding you. And so be careful about conflicting advice. I've gone into viewings where, for example, recently a lady was looking at a ground floor apartment and she brought two friends with her on the second viewing. She had loved it on the first viewing, and on the second viewing, she had one friend who supported the property, another friend who didn't like the property, but for very subjective reasons. And ultimately, she found she wasn't able to make any decision because there was just too much noise, and she stepped away from the property. And that goes back to the point, a great property could be overlooked because you're either taking the wrong advice or because you're not able to think clearly because of the noise or of other people. So always, make sure that you are getting the right advice. If you have children, ask them for advice, but don't rely on them. And let's face it, they might as well know now that they might not be listened to. Okay, so ask them for advice, take their advice into consideration, but you reserve the right to not follow their advice. Okay, everybody in this life has motives. Maybe a motive is that they want mom and dad to move closer to them to be able to spend time with their children, or maybe they want mom and dad to stay in the family home so that their children might have an opportunity to spend more time there or to live there as their family home in the future. So it is important to ask them what they think, but not in terms of being guided by it, but just taking it into account and having asked the question. Nobody likes to not be heard. Get sound financial advice as well, particularly from a taxation point of view. If you sell a house, you have money to buy a new property, maybe you have money left over, maybe you want to spend that on retrofitting what you buy to get the energy efficiency up. Maybe you want to gift some money to your family. Make sure that you're getting the right tax advice here. That is really important. You don't want to incur a tax liability on any of the decisions that you make. So get good tax advice. And again, make sure that your tax advisor is somebody that you completely trust and that is answering your questions with your interests in mind. They're not anybody else's accountant or tax advisor. And then the next step is, as I say, I mentioned before about look at your timeline. Put all of the things on a page that you want to be part of this timeline, whether it's that there's a family occasion coming up, whether it's that you have to sell your house to buy the next house, what time of year it is. Take all of these things into account. Plan, research. The declutter alone is going to take, between 1 and 3 months, perhaps. It is not a thing. Trust me, the decluttering is not a thing that will happen overnight. It takes time. It takes care. It takes emotion. It does also take skip. So give yourself time and factor the time in. So, for example, if you're calling somebody like me out to your property today, the first thing I'm going to say is you're going to have to do your decluttering, and you need to do that before you put your property on the market. So depending on how much, how full your house is and how big your house is, give yourself time to do that so that you're not feeling rushed. Okay. And you want to be able to have a situation really where when you find a house that you like, that you can move quickly on that property. And I don't want my clients to be in a situation where they're rushed or where they have to quickly declutter or quickly make decisions. The reason that I'm focusing on downsizing now is to really help you to be prepared in advance so that there's no panic and there's no rush. Okay, so having your timeline in place and giving yourself time for that crucial decluttering is really important. Remember, when you put your property on the market, depending upon factors such as how the market is, what the time of year is, and so on, and you could be on the market for 1 to 3 months. So factor that into your timeline because that's going to be factored into when you now are getting ready to move, ideal scenario, into your next home. And remember that even when you go sale agreed, after that, you still have maybe a 3-month period for conveyancing. Again, go back to your team and ask them what you can do to minimize all these periods of time so that you are ready to go. Because I can tell you from my experience with so many clients, once my clients make their decision, they want to get going and they want to act. So these pieces of advice are really to help you to steer you in the right direction so that you're making a well-informed decision. So they are my steps with regard to downsizing. Just to recap on what I said to you. Number 1, write down the reasons that you're thinking about moving. For example, is it location? Is it practicality? Is it energy efficiency? Number two, write down then the upsides and downsides of downsizing and see what balances out, what is more outweighing. Number three, look at the costs, money in, money out. Number four, prepare yourself, get down and declutter. Okay, and ask for help about these things. And also prepare yourself, make sure that you surround yourself with a team that you trust and with advice that resonates with you and that advice that makes sense to your specific situation. And then put it all into a timeline around your priorities. For example, maybe you've got a holiday coming up and you don't want to be stressed and moving house at that time. Perhaps, as I say, you've got a family event coming up. We're always here to assist on advice with downsizing or any other property matter or question that you have. So I hope that you found this to be of use. Thank you very much for tuning in. Let us know if you have any questions and we will try to answer them. And in the meantime, thanks again and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.